Thank you for joining us for our webinar, coming to you from the Farm for Scotland's Future campaign. Thank you all for joining. We're expecting 143 people, so there will still be people coming in. Miriam's just shared a very quick video of some of the messages from our recent petition, just to give you a bit of an introduction to what we're going to talk about today. If in the meanwhile you would like to share in the chat who you are and where you're joining us from, that would be great, because it's always good to see where you're all reaching us from. And while you're doing that, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Deborah Long, and I'm Chief Officer at Scottish Environment Link, and I'm going to be chairing this evening. So let's see who we've got joining us and where you're coming from. If you just use the chat function for this, then brilliant. So we've got Dumfries and Galloway, great. On a train, excellent. Oh, we're reaching into England even, so that's great, from Somerset. Great to see everyone joining us. So the way this is going to work is that we're going to use the chat. Please continue to put in who you are and where you're joining us from. We're going to use the chat for comments, any links you want to share, any thoughts you have on the webinar as we go through. And you'll see also at the bottom of your screen a Q&A function. And we're going to use that to ask you to put your questions in there. And then we'll be able to use those to put to our panel, who you can see on the screen already, as we go through. I'll remind you on a regular basis to put your questions into the chat. And I'm also going to ask you to upvote any questions that you particularly want answered. And that's because we're probably going to run out of time this evening. We're here until 7:15, but obviously if you need to leave before then that's absolutely fine. But if you can help upvote questions, then that means that I can make sure that we get to the ones that you really want to see answered quickly. And we'll do that as we go along. So you all know why we're here, because you've all seen the Eventbrite invitation. So I'm not going to run through that again. But basically, we're here because this autumn, we expect to see the Scottish Government introduce a new agriculture bill. And as that bill goes through Parliament, MSPs will be given the opportunity to scrutinise it. And they'll have the opportunity to both propose and vote on amendments. And for that reason, it's really important that MSPs hear what their constituents think about the bill and what they want to see in it. And that's what this evening is about, to help you reach out to MSPs and to give your viewpoint, but also to build awareness of the potential that Scotland's farming sector has for both reducing a carbon footprint and also the impact of the sector on nature, and opportunities for the sector to become more nature and climate positive. So today is all about hearing how you can make a difference by talking to your MSP. And this is in part a response to responses that we had to our last webinar in March, when you asked for more information about how to get in touch with your MSP. So that's what we're here to do. You'll see on the screen that Miriam is here, and Miriam coordinates the campaign, and she'll be posting the campaign website into the chat, plus her email, so that you can follow up with Miriam afterwards if you wish to. Remember, you can sign up to the campaign via the website if you haven't already. And as I say, you can get in touch with us directly by emailing Miriam. And we'll also be sending around a briefing later on that gives you a bit more information about getting in touch with your MSP. So what we have this evening is we have 3 speakers followed by a Q&A session. As I've said, we'll aim to finish by 7:15, but if you need to leave earlier, then that's absolutely fine. I've mentioned about the chat function for comments, advice, or links. And then the Q&A box is where you post your questions for the panel and then upvote those that you really want to see asked. We're also going to run 3 quick polls this evening, and we're going to start with one now. These polls are anonymous, and what I'll do is once Miriam shared them, there you go, it's on your screen already. Just give you a few seconds to answer it. So this one is about meeting and communicating with your MSP. You'll see there's 2 questions, and you'll also see the responses as you share them. So thank you very much for doing that. We've got 55 people, I think, on the call, so we'll just give you a little bit longer to click your answers into that poll. It looks as though we've got about 60% of you, between 60 and 70%, haven't yet met your MSP. And most of that contact is by email or letter. I'll just give you a few more seconds. And we've got some, you'll see people have put other ways that they've met or communicated with their MSP in the chat. So we've got a whole mixture. Great. Okay. Are you happy with that, Miriam, or should we give it a little bit longer? Brilliant. Thank you all for doing that. I'm now going to introduce our first speaker, and that's David Mackay, who is Head of Policy at Soil Association Scotland. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, and hello everybody, good evening. And if you're just going to bear with me a wee second, I'm going to share my screen so you can hopefully see what I'm looking at, which is some slides that I'm going to run through briefly. Many of you probably have been at a previous webinar and will have heard quite a lot about the campaign, so I don't want to dwell too much on the detail, but just very briefly to recap why we're here, what we think is wrong with the current system of funding for agriculture in Scotland, and what we would like to see in the agriculture bill that, as Deborah said, is due to come to Parliament in the next month or so. So our farmers and crofters manage more than 3/4 of our land in Scotland, and in addition to producing food, we really want them to do that in a way that helps us address the twin climate and nature emergencies. And it's probably important to note that many farmers are already doing that, but the problem we have is that over many decades, the cumulative impact of more intensive agricultural practices have driven up emissions and have contributed to biodiversity loss. So there's two main challenges that we have that Scottish Government is trying to address through the legislation that's about to come to Parliament. This is around the climate challenge and the biodiversity challenge, broadly speaking. There's a very ambitious target, and this is just the interim target as we move towards net zero, to reduce agricultural emissions by 31% by 2032. Now that's less than 10 years' time, and to give some context to that, in the 3 previous decades, we managed to reduce emissions by 14.9%. So it's very clear there needs to be a significant uptick in how we achieve that. And on biodiversity, just to make the note that Scotland actually ranks as one of the most nature depleted in the world, 28th from bottom out of 240 countries. And the recent State of Nature report found that nearly half of species in Scotland are in decline. So that's a challenge we're facing, but what's wrong with the way that we currently fund agriculture? Now, it's not simple, it's very complicated, but we can boil it down to a few key points that Scottish Environment Link thinks need to be addressed. And the first one is about the budget and how it is used. So speaking broadly, about 600 million annually is devoted to agriculture. Now, more than 3/4 of that budget goes to direct payments with few conditions attached. So there's a clear opportunity there to make that money work a bit harder and achieve more for the public money that is being put out. Secondly, We have an area-based approach to payments, which essentially means the biggest landowners on the best land get the largest sums of money. So there's an inherent point of fairness there. And to illustrate that, the top 20% of claimants at the moment receive more than 60% of the direct payment budget. And the bottom 40% of claimants, so the smaller farmers, are receiving just 5% of that budget. So there's a serious challenge there around equity and fairness. And in addition to that, the funding that is being spent is not necessarily being targeted to the best effect. So for example, there's just a small amount in the budget is going towards land management that benefits nature. And finally, and this is something that's been underlined by multiple different reports about how we need to adapt to a changing climate, is that at the moment, not nearly enough money is being invested in the advice, the training, and that peer-to-peer knowledge exchange between farmers and crofters that we know is really important. And as I say, multiple reports have identified this as a need to assist with the transition towards more sustainable farming. We need more of the budget being spent in that area. And finally, the bill itself. So essentially what we're saying here tonight is we want to be replacing that funding system. We want to make it work for nature, for climate, and for people. Scottish Environment Link would like to see the current situation turned on its head so that at least 3/4 of the money goes towards reducing emissions and restoring nature. So incentivizing farmers, the types of things that we know will help to deliver on those outcomes. And finally, to make sure that all farmers and crofters are supported in that transition, as I said. So I will stop there and hand over, but I believe I'm coming back later in the programme to talk a little bit more. So thank you for listening just now.
Thank you very much, David. That's brilliant. That's a really good introduction to why we're here, giving the background. And as David said, he will be back later. Can I just remind you all to put any questions you have into the Q&A box, please, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Type your questions in there, and then you'll also be able to upvote the ones that you would like to see answered. We're going to have another poll now. Miriam's going to share another poll, and we'll give you a few seconds to look at this. And we're asking you for the top 3 reasons why you care about farming and crofting. So if you can tick your top 3, please, that would be brilliant. And then we'll be able to see what our motivations are. And again, if you've got another reason, then please just write it in the chat and we can follow you there. I'm going to give you a little bit longer because there's a few more people to give us the top 3 reasons. And then we'll ask Miriam to share the results. Okay. Miriam, do you want to share the results? I realised I didn't ask you last time. That's them there. So you can see the top 3 reasons. We've got climate change, nature restoration and protection, and then third is livelihoods. Oh no, it isn't. It's farming and crofting essential to rural communities, so it is actually about livelihoods. So those are the top 3 of you all coming in here. And healthy food. Great, thank you all. We're going to move on now to our second speaker, and our second speaker is Nora Casey, who is Parliamentary Officer at RSPB Scotland. So I'll hand over to Nora.
Thank you. Like David, I'm going to share my slides now, so bear with me. Hopefully everybody can see that. If you can't, let me know.
Yeah, that's fine, Nora. We can see that.
Great. So I'm here to talk about how to make better laws for nature and climate in Scotland. And as an overview, I'm going to talk about government and parliament in Scotland, how most laws in Scotland are made, how you can help to make laws in Scotland better for nature and climate, how to talk to your MSPs, which most of which would also apply if you're talking to your councillors or your MPs, and thank you in further reading. Apologies, I know the audio was a little bit wonky for David. Let me know if you can't hear me and I'll just say it again. So everybody, if you live in Scotland, has 8 MSPs, 1 for your constituency and 7 that are elected through a list system for your region, which adds up to 129 members of the Scottish Parliament. Again, everybody living in Scotland also has one MP, member of the Parliament in Westminster, and you'll have local councillors as well. I'm not going to talk about those much here, but they can affect decisions that benefit nature and climate, so it's worth talking to them as well. The Scottish Parliament elects the Scottish Government, which currently is headed by First Minister Humza Yousaf, MSP, and under Humza Yousaf sit cabinet secretaries, and under the cabinet secretaries sit ministers. And most issues affecting the environment in Scotland are devolved. So decisions are made about the environment in Scotland. Obviously, decisions for England are made in Westminster. Some decisions in Wales and in Northern Ireland are devolved and some aren't. I'm going to talk a lot about parliamentary committees. The 2 major parliamentary committees for nature and climate are the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee and the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee, although obviously other committees like the Finance Committee can make a big difference for nature and climate as well. So how most laws in Scotland are made. If anybody hasn't been on the Scottish Parliament tour that they do when the Parliament isn't sitting, I strongly recommend it.
Could I just interrupt you? We're not seeing your slides moving on.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's interesting.
We're still looking at your first one.
So
are they moving on for you?
They are moving on for me.
I don't think you're in presenter mode, Nora.
I don't know how to do that. If I'm not already doing that, I'm sorry.
If you go to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little icon that looks like a box on a stick.
I'm not seeing anything like that. I'm sorry.
Next to the slider of the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, of your slide screen.
I can see the 3 dots. It says it's presenter view. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Don't worry. But just bear in mind, we're just looking at your first slide.
I'll
that's
try.
it. You've done it
That's
now.
it. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh,
you've done it.
This is out of presenter view, but at least I'll be able to move the slide on. Can anybody?
Yeah.
Can everybody see what I'm looking at now? How most laws are made in Scotland.
Yes. Yes.
Grand. So I've just been through this one.
Yes.
Which I basically talked through. So there won't be anything here that you've missed. And I have moved on to this one. So if anybody hasn't been to the Scottish Parliament tour that runs when Parliament isn't sitting, I highly recommend it. This is one of the windows in a Scottish Parliament office. At stage 0 of a bill, in effect, the Scottish government says, we're thinking of having a bill on agriculture funding. What does everybody think that should look like? And it's a very open-ended consultation. And at some point, usually some months after that, they publish a draft bill. And at that point, the lead committee, either the Rural Affairs Committee or the Net Zero Committee, usually for environment legislation, will run a second consultation, and there may be side consultations alongside that, which will be much more specific because, of course, at that stage, they've got a bill in front of them. It's in black and white, and they can tell what's being proposed. After that consultation, the committee runs several evidence sessions to gather oral evidence from stakeholders such as RSPB Scotland or Scottish Environment Link or crofters or farmers or could be anybody in Scotland. And after all of those oral evidence sessions, they write a report based on the written and oral evidence. They may also go out on site visits to, for example, a farm on the agriculture bill to see how the policy is going to directly affect people living in Scotland. When they've written their report, the stage 1 vote is held, where the whole of Parliament votes on whether the bill should go ahead in principle. That is the end of stage 1. Assuming they vote that the bill should go ahead, the bill enters stage 2. At stage 2, amendments are made. So any MSP can suggest an amendment, but only the committee members get to vote on which amendments are supported and go into the bill. And then at the end, then at stage 3, the whole of Parliament votes on whether the amended bill should become a law. So that is the potted summary of the legislative process in Scotland. Again, most legislation is proposed by the Scottish Government. There is a process for backbench bills for ordinary MSPs to recommend legislation, but I'm not going to go into that here. So how you can make laws better, what you're here to find out about this evening. I mean, if you're here, you're probably already involved in one or more ENGOs in Scotland, environmental non-governmental organisations in Scotland. So thank you very much for your involvement and your interest in this subject. You can sign up on the Scottish Parliament website or the Scottish Government website to hear about consultations. And when those come up, the more you can respond to them in your own words, the better. I know that takes an awful lot of time. The likes of Scottish Environment Link usually do publish guides for how to respond to consultations, but it works a lot better if it's in your own words and from your own perspective. Again, you've probably already joined an organisation that campaigns on nature and climate, but we're much stronger together than we are as individuals. Contact your MSPs, which I'm going to say a little bit more about, and be persistent and pace yourself, because this is all of the wins we get almost always take years. I have colleagues who've been working 10 years on things, and it's wonderful when those wins happen, but they don't happen every day. So don't get disheartened if you don't see the effects of your advocacy right away. How to talk to your MSPs. A lot of this is about, just as you speak to anybody else, they're human beings. Be polite, be considerate, be constructive. They're trying to do their best. Explain how they can make a difference. Explain how they can make something better. Again, use your own words, your own perspective. We're all affected by nature and climate in Scotland. Think about how this could affect your family or your neighbourhood or your community, whatever it means to you. I think Paul is going to say a little bit more about this, but request a meeting or find out when their local surgery is held. We do a lot of site visits with MSPs, which can be great because it gets them out in nature, and seeing it in real life helps everybody, including MSPs. So if you can do that, obviously with the landowner's permission, if it's not a public place, that's fantastic. And find out what kinds of issues they've raised, because like the rest of us, they all have interests. So you can search the parliamentary website to see what they've raised in Parliament, or you can look at the lobbying register to see who they're meeting with. None of this is secret. Many of them also have newsletters that you can sign up to receive, for example, that will tell you what they're up to. So that might be a good way of forming a connection and saying, well, you're clearly interested in health. Here is how nature and climate benefit health or affect health, for example. And thank you very much for having me. And here's a few of the things I've mentioned. Again, I know this is a very short and sweet presentation. I'm happy if anybody gets in touch with me at the email that I've given. Thank you.
Thanks, Nora. That's brilliant. Do you want to put your email address when you've finished in the chat, and then people can contact you if they'd like to get copies of your references? That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Just a quick reminder from me to put any questions you've got into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. If you click on Q&A, you'll be able to put questions in there. And please upvote those that you would like to see answered. We've got a few that have been upvoted so far. That's really helpful because it helps me prioritise. So now I'm going to introduce Paul Wheelhouse, who is a former MSP and Scottish Government Minister, who is going to tell us how it all works with and how to get in touch with an MSP and be effective. So hand over to you, Paul.
Do my best. I'll not be giving any advice on doing slides, as you'll see in a second, but hopefully the slides will appear. And is that appearing okay for everybody? Have you got
we can
the right
see
version?
that slide. Yeah,
There you go. Hopefully
that's perfect. That's
brilliant. And probably that bubbly chart on the left is probably about as close as I got to finding the Parliament windows without actually using the picture of the Parliament itself. But hi everybody, and I just want to go through some tips, I suppose, from a perspective of someone who's been an MSP as to what works most effectively to get our attention and to help your MSP do the best job of representing your interests. So I'll just flick through these. Apologies, they're appalling slides in terms of being very text heavy, but I hope you can still get some sense of them. So the key thing is there are a number of different ways which Nora has really helpfully gone through, and I've seen the guidance that you're going to get, which is excellent. So that will be coming out as well. And what I would focus on is really just three things. This was three key ways of engaging with your MSP, apart from sort of face-to-face meetings and that you might happen to have on the high street or at local events. Those are really around the kind of more generic kind of campaign emails that you'll probably be able to do through various portals and through maybe membership bodies that you're part of. And then also more bespoke letters, and I would agree wholeheartedly with Nora was saying. I'll come on to just around the more personal, the more detail you can put in yourself, the more you will get probably a very positive reaction from your MSP. And I would repeat again what Nora has said, that MSPs, despite what you might think, are human and are empathetic usually, and despite political differences, I can genuinely say I've not met an MSP that I've either been working in opposition with or working with on the same parliamentary party as myself that had anything other than a desire to try and do the best they could for Scotland and for the people of Scotland. So irrespective of party differences, they're all trying to do the best they can. Some are coming at it with much more knowledge of specific sectors like farming than others. Some may be in representing constituencies that have never do not have farms in any great scale, or maybe one or two farms in the whole constituency. So please bear that in mind when you're engaging with them, that they will be trying to absorb and learn as much as they can. In terms of this kind of more generic campaign emails, the ones that are written effectively by others that you're signing up to and sending to register your support for what's being said, they are really good in terms of a number of facets. They do make it easier for people, particularly those with accessibility issues, to make a comment to support a cause. Those who perhaps find the issue of writing letters intimidating, not knowing where to start, that kind of thing, it can really help get things going. So they are easier to send. Quite often they'll be set up so you can actually pick your MSP from the list or MP from the list and then send it off. So that's helpful. They're very good for helping create a sense of scale of interest for an MSP. So all MSPs these days normally have a casework management system in their office. They will be recording each case that comes in, their staff. They will be allocating probably keywords so they can be searchable, or maybe picking fields, subject fields that come down to drop-down lists so they can actually get a sense as to what's happening, what are the key issues that are affecting my inbox this month. And if they see a surge of cases coming through on the bill or a particular aspect of the bill, that will register with them and their staff, and they will certainly start to focus their interest. You're likely, once an MSP's had the chance, particularly bear in mind an MSP who might be in ministerial office, will probably have to wait until they've got a kind of agreed line because of shared responsibility from colleagues who are leading on the bill to be able to respond to you. But all MSPs, once they've got that standard response in place, they will issue it very quickly. So when you get a response in, you'll usually get a quick reply, and that's very helpful to both sides. The downsides are that normally they are because they are generic and at a high level, they're of limited value to perhaps the MSP in terms of giving them that local information that they can translate a cause to something that they can use in a speech or into a committee intervention or in a debate intervention or speech. So bear that in mind. They're due to the numbers received, which are quite often very, very large numbers for particular campaigns, and their workloads, they're likely to get a lower priority than maybe somebody who's got a housing request or a medical request. So they will probably be dealt with by their office. Once they've got that agreed standard response that they've tailored for you for all responses, they will then issue that, and they may not therefore get that kind of connection from you, knowing that you personally have written to them because it's been dealt with by the parliamentary staff. Not every MSP works in the same way, but I suspect in many cases that will be something that will not quite register with the MSP. So it can leave you as somebody who's writing to them a little frustrated, perhaps, if you don't feel like you've had that personal interaction with your MSP, and you can feel a little bit like sometimes you're getting the party line. MSPs are aware of that. They do try in many cases personalise those responses as best they can, specifically if you've put something added into that generic email. But the next thing I suppose it's really focus in writing to your MSP, and it's picking up where Nora left off really around personal letters or bespoke emails. I would certainly encourage you, if you have the time, to always spend that time. It does make a difference, not least because a personal response will almost always be read by the MSP because it's not the standard generic message to the staff. Will want to see what the MSP wants to do to respond to specific points that have been raised. It's ideal often for an MSP, if it's relating to a bill, to perhaps put in a local issue, or as Nora was suggesting, something that's personal to you, what it means to you as somebody who's responding to the bill. You might be in farming, you might be in the environmental movement and trying to achieve a positive change. So what does it mean to you? The other thing to remember is an MSP can forward on that letter to the minister. So if you specifically ask, I'd like to have the government's response to this point, if there's a particular point you've raised in your bespoke letter, and ask your MSP, or MSPs plural if you're writing to all 8 of them, can they try and get a response from government on this particular point, then they can do that. And ministers will always respond personally to letters from MSPs. So the covering letter, if you like, that goes with your response will be picked up by the minister's private office. The minister will see that, respond to you on that. And that could be also personal bespoke letters can be very useful for the opposite reason to those generic ones that can give that local level of granularity about the particular area the member represents or your particular interest in the subject. That can really help them to frame a chamber speech or to formulate what they're going to say in a committee session. If you're lucky enough to have an MSP that's on the lead committee or the finance committee, then that's a great opportunity for them to have their stamp on the debate, and also in writing to ministers to give a little bit more colour on the subject. And do be clear on any issues of anonymity or confidentiality, please. That's really helpful to everybody concerned. And the last thing an MSP would want to do is to blurt out your name in the chamber and blow your confidentiality out of the water when that's something that's important to you. So please do stress, that if you're having to write in a private capacity or an anonymous capacity for work or other reasons, make sure that's clear. And as with a form letter or campaign, it will also have that impact on the casework system. So you're still having that impact and affecting the kind of stats that the MSP sees about their workload and how strong the support is either for or against particular aspects of the bill or the bill in general. And as I say, it's more likely to elicit a more personal reply. Each MSP is different. I always tended to, if I got a personal response, particularly ones that came in, sometimes I'm old-fashioned in letter form, they would always get that personal attention and try and write back as best I could to reflect the care the person had put into writing to me, to reflect that back to them, that I was noting that they'd put in that effort. Downside is obviously it takes much more time and effort to prepare, as Nora says. That's probably why MSPs like them and they react to them so positively in most cases. It may take a little bit longer, sometimes a good bit longer, depending on the nature of what you've asked, to get a response if it's been tailored to your own letter. And if you are writing for a ministerial response, please allow, without harassing the MSP, there'll be something like 4 or 5 weeks before, it can be up to that before a response will come back from ministers, given the number of cases that are going through their ministerial correspondence system. So it's not the MSPs being slow to respond to you. They will usually give you a holding reply to say they've written to the minister, and it may well take up to sort of four weeks or 25 working days. I'm not sure what the current performance targets are, but it certainly they try very hard to get a response back in that timescale. I think it's always, obviously post-COVID, I'm sure things will have changed a little since I was in Parliament, but we always used to love meeting people, constituents. It's a good thing, as Nora says, a well-timed visit to a business or environmental site that is relevant to the bill concern could make a big difference to what the member actually thinks on the issue and to the contribution they can then make to the debate, because they'll be talking from experience of having seen something, having spoken directly to those affected, having understood what the issues are. If you are going to meet your MSP at advice surgery or visit their office in Parliament in Edinburgh, and I think there's really good guidance in the information that Nora's prepared, or the team have prepared, which talks about the parliamentary working week and when it's most appropriate to visit Parliament, when it's most appropriate to visit the constituency. So please do take that into account. I'm not going to repeat all that because it's very good. But if you can book a slot in advance, quite often MSPs will advertise surgeries as being open surgeries, and that's because most people tend to communicate by email these days. So often it's a case of you don't have people clamoring to go to surgery, so you offer an open surgery. And but you do always encourage, I think, people to book in advance. That means that somebody's coming, that you hopefully, if you can brief them in advance about something specific you want to talk about, as I think it's always good practice. It will give the chance for the MSP's office to make sure the MSP has the appropriate briefing that is ready for your visit, and hopefully will give you better quality answers than catching them off guard with something that perhaps they're not as well briefed on, particularly if you're thinking about MSPs in urban areas perhaps that aren't really knowledgeable about farming in general. And that's a horrible generalization, but that's probably a fair one in most of the time. So if you can do that, book early. If you can arrive a bit early, sometimes I know many constituents who visit me were lucky. They got a longer slot because somebody had finished earlier than we expected, and so they got an extra 5-10 minutes. If you equally, if you know it's a busy surgery, please do be respectful of that, because the MSP will be desperate to get on to the next person and try and make sure they're not disappointing them. So it's a horrible thing to say, but don't overstay your welcome. You can book it if you feel you need more time or you want to do follow-up. Then I think most MSPs would be very open to that. In terms of if you either, it might be that the surgery is not fully booked, so you can come back in 10 minutes, or indeed have a follow-on meeting or a Zoom meeting these days. It's all very normal. So if you have done that, you've booked early, you've given them the information they need, they should get a good session out of your MSP, and try and focus on what outcome you want from the case that you're raising with them. So is it you want them to support the bill? Is there a particular amendment you want them to support? Is there something you want them to oppose? Is there perhaps something you want to raise with ministers or seek clarification on? Is there something you want a particular response on? If you go in knowing what you want and you have clarity about that, I would suggest you probably have a very good chance of getting what you need. Can't always guarantee the member will be able to vote the way you want them to. That's something you have to go into it, but they will end up being better briefed on the position you've got. Hopefully they may have the chance through back channels as well to influence if they're concerned that they actually agree with you, but they can't say that. I've been in that position myself. You then use those channels with your colleagues to say, hang on, there's a point here I'm comfortable with. And so even ministerial MSPs and backbenchers in the government party can have an impact, even if they can't say so at the time. They've got opportunities to converse with their colleagues and try and persuade, and that does happen. If you do rely on it, if you wanting to talk about facts and figures and so forth, don't be embarrassed about bringing your notes with you. Make sure you're well prepared so that you feel like you're getting the best out of the session. And it can be really helpful to the member as well to have those data sources handy. So say, oh, that's a really interesting figure, where do you have that? Then you're able to give them that information straight away. That'll ensure that they can act more quickly. So that's where I was on that. I was going to just, if I can, just talk about some things to do with the government side of things, if that's helpful, Deborah. So I'll stop sharing. I think it's one of these situations where I suppose I've got a different perspective. Some MSPs have been on both sides of the fence, both as a backbencher and as a government minister, and I've taken 8 bills through Parliament, and it can be quite challenging. Obviously, you have the opportunity with a debate like this to have quite strong positions on either side. There'll be, I'm sure, quite entrenched positions around the changes proposed in terms of funding. And the process of debate around the bill can have added value, and that not everything perhaps that people want will get into the bill itself. At the end of the day, both sides may be unhappy, everybody might be unhappy, but there's, I think as Nora was indicating and David earlier, there's still a chance that things will get picked up through other types of channels. So there's further legislation, there's other measures that can be taken, annual budgets can have an impact on if there's a spending decision that can't be reflected in the bill, it might be something that can be dealt with out with the bill. So don't lose heart if you're making points and you don't feel that they're ultimately dealt with in the bill. You may well have still managed to register your point. And the ministerial correspondence system also works to collate the numbers of issues that are being raised by MSPs, MPs, and councillors. So they are very much monitoring the kind of things that are coming forward as well. And sometimes I suppose it's choosing your battles, and also making sure that when you are pushing for targets, those targets can be evidenced, that they can be delivered, because that can be the biggest issue. That it's not that there's a lack of willingness on the part of anybody involved in the bill in the Parliament to follow your advice and your wishes. It's about they're concerned about deliverability, credibility, and losing that credibility. So governments are judged on performance. Opposition are obviously judged on their own aspirations, their claims. They come up when, especially elections, are judged on what they said should be done as well. So everybody in that has got that in the back of their minds, that they're going to be judged ultimately against the targets that they accept. I hope that's helpful, Deborah. I'm probably going on too long, but hope that's helpful. I'm happy to take any questions later.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. That's really helpful. It's really helpful to get the tactics and the expectations that we have on both sides. I'm going to just remind you all to put your questions into the Q&A box and to upvote those that you particularly want answered. There's quite a lot on topics coming through, fewer on tactics. So if there's any tactical questions you want to ask, then please do put them in there. And David's going to give us just a little summary before we go into the Q&A, and that should leave us about half an hour for the Q&A session. So David, over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, I'm just in the process of sharing my screen again. It'll take a second, but just to quickly bring us back to the agriculture bill itself. So essentially, this bill will deliver on the Scottish Government's vision for agriculture, which some of you may have seen was published last year. And there are 3 main elements to that. The first is high quality food production. The second is climate mitigation and adaptation. And the third is nature restoration. So very much in line with what I was talking about earlier. And I think it's important to note that we have statutory targets for meeting emissions reduction through the Climate Change Act, and those were supported at the time by every party in Parliament. And we are going to have a natural environment bill which will also enshrine in law nature restoration targets. So these are not optional measures, these are targets that are actually set in law that the government has to meet. And we want to see that budget that I mentioned earlier working as hard as it can, because we would love it if there was more money available, but we sincerely hope that the budget is at least maintained. That money working as hard as possible to help farmers, to help crofters deliver for nature and for climate whilst producing high quality food as they are already doing. So the 3 key points to take away, and bearing in mind that you're going to have the briefing document sent to you as well, so please don't think you have to scribble this stuff down. The first one is essentially that we need to transform our farming system. Now, this has been recognised in the government's vision for agriculture. there are lots of things that I mentioned earlier have accumulated over a number of years and are not the fault of farmers in any way. There were market drivers, there were public policy drivers for the way in which farming has developed over many decades, and it did become that bit more intensive and reliant on chemicals, and at certain points farmers were being paid to remove hedges, and now we're in a position of lobbying for money to make sure that we can restore hedges. So we know that there are challenges. We also know that those challenges can be addressed. There are many farmers and crofters out there already doing amazing things. They're reducing their inputs, they're integrating trees, they are using different approaches to farming that are helping them to reduce emissions and bring nature back to their farms. And it's also important to note that in many of those cases, they're also saving money, reducing inputs in particular, and there are many examples which we can share and you can see on the Farm for Scotland's Future website where farmers have actually reduced their costs by reducing artificial inputs. The second point, and this one is really important because there's been a lot of discussion about food security, and often that's equated simply with food production. The reality is we cannot have food security without a stable climate and a healthy natural environment. You know, I work for the Soil Association, and we have been in existence for more than 75 years, and the organisation was set up on the basis that there is an indivisible link between the health of soil, the health of plants, the health of animals, and the health of humans. Now, we're currentely losing soil each year, somewhere in the region of 900,000 tonnes, which is enough to fit into Murrayfield Stadium. The erosion has been estimated by James Hutton to be costing about £50 million a year. So there are real economic issues as well as environmental issues at play here, but we must address the climate and nature issues if we're going to have sustainable food production in the long term. And finally, I talked about this one before, that the third point is that the system that we have at the moment isn't working particularly well. The National Farmers Union has described it as a system that incentivizes inertia. And if you agree that it needs to change, I think I've mentioned earlier that some of the inequities around the way in which the funding is distributed, we certainly think that could be done in a much more fair manner. And this is not about choosing between food production and environment. The two very much go hand in hand. And this is not about reducing the budget or taking money away from farmers. Actually, this is about saying, yes, the government will continue to support farmers and crofters, but you are going to be asked to do different things in order to receive that funding. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to put my email address in the chat, so please do get in touch with me if you want to discuss any of this in any more detail. And there's more in the briefing document that's going to be circulated. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, David. So just to recap, you'll receive a briefing very shortly, and that will be about how to contact your MSP, about the mechanics of it. If you would like to send something to your MSP that summarises what David has just outlined in terms of the three major asks, then please use the summary note of our report that we published very, very recently. The only thing to note is that although we published it recently, since we've done that, agriculture has in fact jumped from the third to the second in terms of emissions. So transport is the only sector now that's higher in producing emissions than agriculture. And Miriam will post the link to that summary in the chat so you've got access easily to that. So we're just going to quickly do our third and final poll. And we want to find out about how you now feel about talking to your MSP about the agriculture bill. And then as soon as we've done the poll, and I'll just give you a few seconds to answer this one because it should be quite quick, we're going to go into the Q&A, and I'm going to try and cover as many questions as possible. So we'll focus on those that have been upvoted. And for those of you that do need to leave, I've just noticed a couple of comments in the chat. There will be a you will be able to watch this afterwards, so you'll be able to watch it at your leisure, and you'll receive the recording. So Thank you all. That's good. Most of you are, well, the majority are fired up. Some of you obviously are nervous, and then we've got some other, hopefully you'll be able to put what other feelings you have in the chat. But that's great. 52% of you are fired up. That's great. Okay, I'm going to open up the floor. Just to finish off on talking to your MSP, if you do talk to your MSP, it would be great if you could let us know, if you could email Miriam. And that's because it's really helpful for us to know that you have been emailing your MSP and to know which MSP have heard from their constituents about this really important issue. So let's kick off with questions. I'm going to get through as many of these as I can. The one that's most popular at the moment is one from Thomas, and that is, can the Scottish Government prioritise turning funding on its head without inadvertently disincentivising active farming and food production? I'll ask David to answer that one first and then see if the other two panellists want to come in on it. And then after that, we'll go to a question from Claire about trees on farms. So David, do you want to have first bash at that question about turning funding on its head?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's a really good point. It speaks to the challenge that faces the Scottish Government, but the answer to me is yes. So as I said, just in my remarks with that last slide, we cannot get into a situation where we're choosing between food production and the environment. It has to be both, and it can be both. So when we're talking about a real allocation of the funding, you might be familiar with the kind of framework that the Scottish Government is proposing, which is across 4 tiers. So essentially what we're saying is that 3/4 would be across tiers 2, 3 and 4. Now tiers 2 is still a direct payment. It's just that there's going to be conditions attached to that, and that's already what Scottish Government is proposing. I think there's a strong argument to be made to be moving towards a system whereby farmers are rewarded for doing things that will help restore nature, will bring down their emissions. And as I said, many of those things will also deliver cost savings when it comes to, for example, reducing inputs.
Thank you very much, David. Paul or Nora, do you want to come in on that? Or should we talk about trees on farms? Paul?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I suppose it's a point I should make as a former, I suppose, gamekeeper turned poacher scenario. I was the gamekeeper as a minister, I suppose, in a sense. But yeah, not in any other sense, I should stress. But the point around this would be really just that by the time the bill has reached Parliament at stage 1, and the debate is really around general principles, and as David's alluded to, there's obviously a lot of work's gone into trying to find common ground. You're probably not going to get radical changes. It's no harm asking for it. As I say, I think no harm in saying that, but there will be aspects of the bill, and I'm not as close to it as Nora or David are. There'll be some things which, will be equivalent to pushing water uphill to try and get changed at this point in the process. So you need to sort of, I suppose, pick your battles and go after the things you think you can actually affect change on. And obviously MSPs can dig a bit deeper at committee and so forth and interrogate the ministers about why they've taken a particular stance. But I suppose there's a lot of work going in such a sort of an emotionally charged kind of debate there will be around farming, because it's such an important sector, but there's so much that obviously is important around climate change and protecting biodiversity as well. So there's very strong views, and hopefully a lot of common ground can be found. But it's just to recognise that without sounding defeatist, it's there will be limits on what the ministers can do at that point at stage 1 within the remaining timescale that's left to get through the parliamentary procedure. So getting in early, obviously, if you can try and influence things before the bill is drafted, is obviously perfect. But there still will be that committee inquiry I think Nora was referring to earlier, that the Rural Affairs Committee will be. That's a really good vehicle to try and get into there some change, so that you've got the ability for the committee to scrutinise the suggestions that are being brought forward, to interrogate ministers about anything they like the sound of, that they want to suggest to ministers. And so that's quite a good way of using that last chance saloon to get stuff into the bill at stage 1. And not everything has to go in. The other thing is to say not everything has to go in the bill itself, where you've got a bill like this where you'll be secondary legislation that will come on the back of it. So you've got the primary legislation. Sometimes people refer to the face of the bill, things being on the face of the bill. Have the debate now, but it may well be that you rely on the secondary legislation to deliver the detail on the point that David was making around that area of funding, which is maybe conditional. Don't expect all the conditionality to be set now. It's something that maybe needs working groups and other things to work on. So if you get that victory, that's in there, expect the detail to be in the secondary legislation rather than the bill itself. So don't be disappointed if you don't see every minutiae of detail in the bill when it's ultimately published.
Thank you very much, Paul. Just highlighting there how we can use the process better. I said we were going to talk about trees on farms, so we will do that. So this is a question from Claire. I'm not sure which of the panel will want to answer this, so wave at me. We currently import over 80% of timber per year into the UK. The UK government has put in place 30,000 hectares of tree planting per year. How do you foresee the new agriculture bill will support farmers to plant trees on farms? And then after this, we'll go on to questions from both Steve, Thomas and Chris about bringing in other opinions and bringing people along with the views that we would like to see. So Claire's question, trees on farms. Who would like to have a bash at that? David, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Deborah. So this is a topic that at Soil Association we're really involved in, and I think someone in the chat mentioned the agroforestry show last week. So we actually did some modelling last year with Cumulus in Scotland, which looked at various different scenarios of planting across agricultural land in Scotland. And the one scenario that we picked out and reported on was that if we had between 1 to 5% cover on agricultural land in Scotland across different farm types, that would deliver an additional 342,000 hectares of trees out with woodland by 2050. So there's a potential there for Scotland's farmers and crofters to make quite a sizable contribution towards tree planting targets. There's lots of barriers and there's lots of things in the way of that happening, but we're trying to highlight those and work with Scottish Government and Scottish Forestry to address those. But there's a huge opportunity, and I think we would love if the bill itself referenced that. I think it's more likely this is going to be one of those things, as Paul mentioned, it comes down to secondary legislation rather than being on the face of the bill itself. But it's certainly something that at Soil Association and other organisations like Woodland Trust we're working very closely and lobbying government about.
Great, thanks, David. I'll move on to the next questions, if that's okay with the rest of the panel. I'm going to combine a question from Steve McMinn and from Thomas Pendlebury about getting farming opinion into policy-making spaces. So Thomas's question is, a lion's share of Scottish land is managed by farmers. Given the increase in need for land to fulfil multiple roles and the increasing number of opinions on management, is farming opinion becoming underrepresented in policy-making spaces? And I'm combining that with Steve's point about what specific actions do we have to take to make sure that the messages about environmental nonsense are not given undue prominence. So who would like to tackle that one? How do we get farmer opinions to align with ours? Paul?
I can do that, yeah. I mean, I've got to be careful with my non-political role that I now have. I can't talk too much about politics. But yeah, I mean, I think it'd be fair to say that there are a number of MSPs across the chamber that are farmers or have interest in farming. So there is, certainly it's one of the, I suppose, the strengths of the Scottish Parliament since it was founded. There's always been, a kind of core of members that have got that direct farming experience, which is really valuable. Obviously, you want Parliament to represent the country as a whole. But the farmers do bring the particular knowledge there. But I do think there's other avenues as well where that farming knowledge can and is actually brought into the policy making process. So clearly, they're probably NFUS are a very powerful organisation, very well resourced organisation, and therefore very good and effective as Environment Link are in terms of working with ministers on policy development. So that's an angle. But locally, usually, certainly in my case in South of Scotland, when I represent South of Scotland, we had regular meetings with NFUS members. So it was kind of a parliamentary briefing. So they would use usually the kind of committee chairs and the local sort of branch representatives would effectively meet with the local MP, MSPs, and sometimes councillors to talk over issues that were relevant to them. So that's make sure that we've got our listening gear on, listening to what they are saying, but also they were quite often asking for feedback about particular initiatives. It changes in use in chemicals. I remember, is it fipronil, the bracken control stuff, that these kind of things are often raised with MSPs and MPs in these kind of local settings. But it does give a chance also to explain why things are the way they are, so why legislation has been formed in a certain way, and to try and communicate as well, because it shouldn't always be one-way traffic. So we're able to represent why Scottish Parliament is doing certain things, and why environmental management and net zero are both very, very important to us as a country, and also to get feedback on that. So it's kind of an iterative process. So I think there's good avenues there, but just to reassure those who wrote the question that there are a good number of farmers across all different political parties that are in Parliament, so they are getting their voices heard, and there's formal engagement and informal engagement as well.
Nora, would you like to come in on that one?
Just to say, I mean, I talked briefly about site visits. I know it's time consuming, but and has to fit in with all of the other things that farmers are doing year in, year out. But if you can invite your MSP to a site visit to your farm or a neighbouring farm, that's incredibly powerful, and you can show them all manner of things that are hard to explain when you're sat in somebody's office. So I think farmers are in a good position on that. Although it is time consuming, and I respect that farmers are busy. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Nora. I'm going to go for a tactical question now. One from Morag, which is how to identify MSPs that are sitting on the fence on issues, i.e. that might be able to swing votes or trends. And that's been sneakily upvoted by Jen, who asked a very similar question a bit further down about what tactics should we be using to demonstrate what the issues are from different perspectives. So how do we identify those MSPs who might be able to help us with the trends? Paul, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yes, certainly. I mean, in the past, it's quite often evident, even when you were the minister leading a bill, that you've got colleagues or colleagues across the chamber, I should stress when I'm saying that, not just my own party, that had concerns about a bill, or that were in the parliamentary debates. Often, if you follow members' debates as well, you'll often see members' debates are on particular subjects. You know that somebody will have perhaps a view that's counter to their party's view. So if you follow, relevant members' debates, you will see members speaking more openly than they can do in a normal debate around a government or opposition motion, more freely, shall we say, about their thoughts about a subject, and giving more of a personal stamp on a debate. And that's often a good sign as to where people's true views are standing. Now, unfortunately, across all parties, and I say unfortunately because I never really enjoyed it myself, the parliamentary whips they do have a role, and they do obviously maintain party discipline in any party. But there still is scope for members to raise their concerns with the party whips if they're unhappy with some things. So you can send some signals. Sometimes people do not turn up for a vote when they're not happy. That's as we know from the press, that's one way in which people manage that issue. But quite often people will be quite open about the fact they have concerns. So there are members across the chamber who will speak quite openly on a subject and say that where they are. And ultimately, it's a good way to work with them. I think government and opposition would probably welcome members bringing forward their amendments. So it's a way to to influence things. Have a member bring forward their own amendment to a bill. Government members, government party members, or parties, as we have now with both the Green Party and the SNP, can amend the bills themselves, and quite often that's a good way of doing it. They'll be seen as doing it in a consensual way, working with government to improve the bill, to get the wording right. Quite often the worst thing that can happen is you've got a really good idea, but the terrible drafting of the amendment, and that means it has to be bumped off as an amendment when actually people sympathise with why it was there. So often it's that opportunity to get a lot out of the tone of the minister or the lead member if it's a private member's bill as to their openness to engaging with people. That's another thing. And then in the debate, they will often indicate in the stage 1 debate, particularly if they're interested in something a member has said, where they want to work with them to work on that. So there's often signals from both sides, both from the members themselves as to, I'm not quite happy with this, I want to have a chance to shape this, and they may even suggest they might bring forward an amendment of their own. In the committee stage, there'll be committee members will have a chance to amend as well. So you watch for those signals, but quite often you can get signals from, say, from a members' debate that's on a similar subject. People will say exactly what they feel. They might be championing farming or championing a particular type of farming, perhaps, and you know that they're open to perhaps increasing investment in biodiversity or something of that nature. So you've got somebody who's on the same wavelength and perhaps has the appetite to seek to constructively amend the bill. So yeah, I guess Deborah and other colleagues will know that themselves. They'll have seen that in the past, that people quite often give a little verbal hint that they're either not happy or they're quite keen to see something improved in the bill.
Thanks, Paul. That's really helpful. I'm going to try and squeeze in another 3 or 4 questions if I can. There's one from Joanna about CAP, which I'll go to next. So either David or Nora might want to answer that. But then there's a couple further down the Q&A chain about protecting old habitats or destroying old habitats in order to restore it. And then I'm going to link that to the biodiversity survey question from Jill. But first of all, from Joanna, we've got a question. I've heard that Scotland's desire to stay close to the CAP, which is largely area-based, in case we re-enter the EU at some point, is hindering real change in the farming subsidy scheme. How do we work around this? David, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the Scottish Government does have a commitment to alignment with EU policy and legislation where practicable. That doesn't mean that we have to necessarily stay with there's some flexibility within the system which could the Scottish Government could decide to take up. There's one thing in particular which is being looked at and has been put off, I think, which is a review of the 3 region model that we currently have, and looking at whether that could be changed and improved. And I think that we tend to focus, when we think about the CAP and Scottish Government wanting to stay aligned, we tend to focus on the positives of that, because there's lots of things happening at EU level that we like. For example, through the Farm to Fork strategy, they've got targets for reducing pesticides, they've targets for reducing synthetic fertilizer, there's a land target for increasing organic farming. These are lots of things, as the organisations involved with Scottish Environment Link would like to see Scottish Government following, but there should be enough flexibility for the Scottish Government to design a system that actually works better for Scotland's farmers and crofters, and that's what we're hoping they're going to do.
Many thanks, David. Let's keep going and see if we can squeeze in a few more questions. One from B. Boyd. I've noticed that local farmers are destroying existing old habitats so they can show they're doing something to restore it again. The current system incentivizes active management, even if environmentally undesirable, rather than being paid to leave existing wild habitats to thrive. Will the bill address this? And I wonder if, when you answer that, we could link in whether there could be biodiversity surveys carried out on farms who've brought in new practices so that they can evidence changes that have been implemented. Nora or David? Nora? Yep.
Sure. Again, it might not be on what Paul has referred to as the face of the bill, but there definitely has to be scope for payments for maintenance once you've done everything that's practicable on your farm, or maybe you're building up capital to buy the next piece of machinery that's going to let you do the next thing, but you're still maintaining your hedgerow, for example. That should absolutely be something that you can look for payment for, and not just new stuff. And there also needs to be funding for, I think David mentioned it in one of his slides, more bespoke advisory services, so that you'd know what was right to do on your land, because no 2 farms are alike. And that would also include things like baseline biodiversity surveys, so that you know what you're starting with. Maybe you have a wonderfully biodiverse farm, and an expert can suggest one or two things you might do even better, but you might be starting from a very good place, and that should be captured.
Thank you very much, Nora. Any final points, David and Paul, on that?
Deborah, I'm sorry, can you remind me, what was the second half of that question again?
The second half is, can there be biodiversity surveys carried out on farms who've brought in new practices so there's evidence to show others that the changes they've made are working?
So this is a really important point. And I talked to some crofters, for example, who have done amazing things for a really long time and are worried that they're not going to be rewarded for things that they've done in the past, which have really increased biodiversity on their holdings, and instead the money is going to go to people who, in their words, have been trashing the land for years. I think one of the things Scottish Government's trying to do to address that challenge is the national testing programme, which has been running now for must be about a year plus. So started off with soil testing, carbon audits, and as part of that, there will be biodiversity audits. I think there are challenges, or there have been challenges, with developing the right system to adequately measure that. It can be incredibly difficult depending on where you are in the farm, at what time of year, what the weather's like, what day of the week it is, and what you might find with some of these surveys. So I think there's some big challenges, and I know that Nature Scotland's been looking into this as well. But the short answer to a long question is yes, that there will be some form of way of measuring biodiversity. It's just going to be tricky getting it right and accurate. Thank you.
I think that's been an underlying theme. It's going to be tricky, but keep going. Paul, do you want some final thoughts before I wrap up?
Just a very brief comment on that. I think that's one of those areas where it's vital to the success of the bill and to the impact that we all want to see, both successful farming sector, but importantly, biodiversity loss reversed and climate change tackled. So these are all hopefully things we can all agree are sensible things to do. So it's the kind of thing that you might want to see in the bill, reference to a commitment to post-legislative scrutiny to maintain, scrutiny on that and evaluation and monitoring, and then the detail comes in the secondary legislation. So don't, it's just a good example, I suppose, of don't expect to get down to minutiae of what you're expecting to record at this point in time. Give yourself time to get that right, to get the framework right, and to get the measurement right, to pick up the points that David and Nora are saying. But certainly to get a government commitment, a parliamentary commitment to evaluate. It's one thing the Parliament's not done as well as it wanted to do. I'm pretty sure from the opening days we did a parliamentary inquiry about this, is that post-legislative scrutiny. So a lot of legislation is passed and it's there forever. The Parliament doesn't review whether it actually works as intended and improving it. So I think that's something that maybe would be worth pushing for.
Great, thank you very much. It just falls to me then, I'm aware that everyone is needing to go and get their dinner. Thank you all for attending, and thank you particularly to our three speakers. Just a quick reminder that you can sign up to receive campaign emails if you haven't done already. And Miriam's just put the link for that in the chat, so you can do that really easily. Also a reminder that Miriam will be really interested in finding out if you do meet or talk to your MSP and how you get on with that. And of course, you can get in touch with us directly by emailing Miriam on her address, and you've got lots of links in the chat, so please do use those. You will also receive, the briefing will be available on how to take this forward. That will come to you via email, and it will also be on our website. And our supporters will receive an email with the recording in it as well. So there you go, lots of information in the chat. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks to our speakers too. Thanks, everyone.